What if everything you knew about the Emperor was a lie? What happens when the foundation of the Imperium starts to crack? How would humanity react when their greatest truth is shattered? For 10,000 years, humanity has clung to one sacred truth. The Emperor of mankind is not just a man, but a living. His presence, though unseen, is the lifeblood of the Imperium, the guiding force that has held humanity together across the stars. Every victory, every sacrifice, every prayer has been made under the belief that the Emperor watches over us. His protection is absolute, his will divine. For centuries, his light has been the foundation of the Imperium's strength. But what if that light is nothing more than a fading ember? What if the Emperor, the god who is said to protect us, has been gone for millennia? The very thought is terrifying, isn't it? To wake up and realize that the divine figure you've worshipped, who has shaped your entire existence, might have never been a god at all. How do you process that kind of revelation? The faith of billions, the very soul of the Imperium, was built on the Emperor's supposed divinity. It's what kept humanity united, what gave purpose to every action, to every life. But what happens when that purpose collapses? When you discover that the Emperor has been dead for thousands of years, and everything you believed to be true was nothing but a lie. The whispers started small, almost imperceptible at first, unnoticed. But to those who dared to listen, they grew louder, more insistent. It began with Inquisitor Odin, a man who had spent his entire life upholding the Emperor's faith, purging heretics and burning worlds to keep the Imperium strong. He had devoted everything to the Emperor, and yet it was his discovery that would bring everything crashing down. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic moment. It wasn't a thunderclap that shattered the skies. It was a slow, creeping terror. Odin had been performing a routine psychic interrogation of a captured navigator from House Belisarius. But something was off. At first, it was nothing but a strange sensation, a flicker in the warp, a hint of interference, a whisper within the psychic feedback. The navigator's mind was in turmoil, yes, but this felt different. The crackling static in the warp, the pattern emerging from the navigator's mind. It wasn't just a malfunction. It was something deeper, something terrifying. The imprint was unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the navigator. It was coming from the heart of Terra itself, from the Emperor's golden throne. Odin dismissed it at first. A defense mechanism, surely. A psychic trap. But as the sessions continued, the pattern didn't go away. It grew stronger. Each prisoner, no matter their crime, carried the same psychic imprint. It was as if they were all linked to one singular point, one singular place, Terra, to the Golden Throne, to the Emperor. But why was it there? The answer came to him in a wave of cold realization. The Emperor was dead. His soul, scattered long ago into the warp, had left behind nothing but a corpse, a machine, sustained only by the sacrifice of thousands of psychers every day. What the Imperium had been worshipping, what humanity had been blindly following, was not a god at all. It was an empty shell, a lie perpetuated through generations. The truth felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. It was overwhelming. There was no time to process, no time to come to terms with the enormity of what he had uncovered. The truth had broken free, and once it did, it spread like wildfire. The Emperor, the divine protector, was gone. His soul had dissipated into the warp, and everything the Imperium had stood for was built on a foundation of lies. The realization didn't come with anger. It didn't come with clarity. Instead, it came with dread, a hollow, gnawing emptiness. The Emperor was gone, and with him, the very purpose of humanity's existence. But what happened next? What happens when the truth spreads beyond Odin, beyond the Inquisition? What happens when the Emperor's death becomes known to all? Would faith survive? Or would humanity collapse under the weight of the truth? At first, the whispers were just that, rumors. Fleeting words spoken in dark corners, hushed conversations in the shadow of the emperor's absence. But then it became undeniable. Worlds began to burn. Faith shattered like glass, and with it, the very soul of the Imperium. The truth had escaped, and with it came an unthinkable question. If the Emperor was never a god, then what are we fighting for? What happens when the Emperor is gone, and the galaxy is left to face the darkness without him? What happens when the most loyal servant of the Imperium, a man who has spent his entire life fighting for the Emperor, discovers that the very foundation of his faith is a lie? How does one cope with the unbearable truth? Inquisitor Odin had always been resolute in his faith. As an agent of the Inquisition, he had sworn an unbreakable oath to protect humanity from the heretical whispers that sought to tear the Imperium apart. For years, he had hunted the enemies of the Emperor with unwavering devotion, burning heretics and purging false gods. To Odin, there was no room for doubt, no space for weakness. The Emperor was a god, and humanity was safe under his divine protection. This truth had guided him, driven him, and defined every action he had taken. But that truth, it wasn't true, and Odin's world began to unravel the moment he realized it. At first, it seemed like an odd fluke, nothing more than a brief psychic interference during a routine interrogation. He had captured a navigator from House Belisarius, a woman whose mind was clouded with secrets and lies. Odin's task was simple: extract the information needed to protect the Imperium. But when he probed deeper, he felt something shift, a disturbance like a ripple in the warp. It wasn't just the navigator's mind, it was something far more profound. He tried to ignore it, dismissed it as a trick of the warp. After all, he had always believed in the Emperor's guidance. Surely, the psychic imprint was just some leftover trace, a residual effect of the navigator's mind. But it wasn't. The more Odin pressed, the clearer it became. The pattern was undeniable, growing stronger with each passing interrogation. He saw it in the minds of the prisoners, heard it in their whispers. The same psychic signature, faint but distinct, emanated from the heart of the Imperium, Terra, the Golden Throne, the Emperor's sacred seat. And that was when the truth hit him like a bolt from the heavens. The Emperor was dead. The weight of the revelation almost crushed him. Odin stood frozen, his mind reeling from the implications. The Emperor, the very being he had sworn to protect, had been gone for millennia. His soul had been scattered into the warp, and the machine that held his body in place was all that remained. The Emperor was not a god. He never had been. The Golden Throne, which had been sustaining the lie of his divinity, was powered not by the Emperor's will, but by the sacrificial souls of psychers, burned every day to maintain the illusion of his protection. Odin's stomach churned, the psychic imprint growing more intense, more undeniable. His vision blurred, and for a moment he could feel the crushing weight of his own doubt. It felt like the walls were closing in around him. How could this be real? How could the very foundation of the Imperium be built on such a fragile lie? He felt like his world was collapsing beneath him. But it wasn't just the weight of the discovery that shook him. It was the guilt, the deep, gnawing guilt that settled in his chest. For his entire life, he had served the Emperor, had hunted heretics in the name of a god that didn't exist. He had burned entire worlds in the belief that he was protecting humanity from the darkness. He had never questioned the Emperor's divinity. But now, faced with the cold, undeniable truth, Odin realized that he, too, had been deceived. And what did that make him? He wasn't a loyal servant anymore. He was a heretic. The thought twisted in his gut. He had been the one to uphold the Emperor's sacred will, the one to enforce the doctrine of the imperial cult. And yet here he was, faced with the horrible truth that the Emperor was gone, that everything he had ever fought for had been a lie. And now the truth was out. There was no turning back. Odin's mind raced with the enormity of what he had uncovered. What was left of the Imperium now? If the Emperor was not a god, if the very foundation of humanity's faith had been shattered, what remained? Was the Imperium doomed to collapse under the weight of this revelation? Would humanity tear itself apart, consumed by the chaos of disbelief? But the worst part was yet to come. Odin had seen what this discovery had done to him. What would it do to the millions of others who had given their lives to the Emperor's will? To the soldiers, the priests, the citizens who had lived their entire lives in service to a false god? Odin couldn't escape the truth. It had already begun to spread, and with it came the terrifying possibility of the galaxy unraveling. What if the rest of humanity realized the truth? Would they rise up in defiance, or would they simply fall into despair? Would they turn on each other in the face of this shattering truth? As the realization settled in, Odin found himself standing at the edge of an abyss. There was no going back. The Emperor was dead, and the Imperium had been built on a lie. The galaxy would burn. The question now was not if the Imperium would fall, but when. What happens when the Emperor's death shakes the very foundation of the galaxy? Can humanity find a way to survive when its greatest lie is exposed? The ripple of shock that followed Odin's discovery spread faster than the flames of a wildfire. The Emperor was dead. His soul had long since dissolved into the warp, leaving only the hollow shell of his body, upheld by the sacrifice of countless psychers. It was a truth so terrible, so utterly world-shattering, that it was almost impossible to comprehend. Yet the moment the truth began to spread, the galaxy was forced to face it, and face the consequences. Odin's own internal chaos was mirrored in the wider reaction of the Imperium. The heart of the Imperium, Terra itself, was the first to crack. Riots erupted in the hives and streets, fueled by disbelief, fear, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. Citizens who had once knelt in worship to the Emperor's golden throne now found themselves without purpose. The prayers that had filled the air for millennia were now replaced by cries of confusion, terror, and rage. Odin could still hear their voices, the chant of heretics, the whispers of rebellion echoing in his mind. The Emperor is dead. The throne is empty. It wasn't just a handful of radicals. It was a groundswell of humanity, ordinary people who had lived their entire lives under the Emperor's divine protection. Now, with that protection gone, they were left to grasp at whatever they could, and many turned to the dark powers of chaos. But even before the full collapse, the seeds of discord had been sown. The Adeptus Mechanicus, once loyal to the Emperor as the Omnissiah, was the first major faction to fracture. As soon as the truth was out, divisions began to appear among the tech priests. Some clung to the idea that the Emperor's body, his physical form, must be preserved at all costs. Others, more radical, declared that it was time to break free of the Emperor's dogmatic rule, seeking to create a new machine god to guide humanity. Old alliances, formed in the crucible of the Great Crusade, began to crumble as the Mechanicus split into factions, each fighting for dominance over the remnants of imperial faith. Among the Space Marines, the reaction was no less intense. The most devout chapters, like the Imperial Fists and Ultramarines, publicly reaffirmed their loyalty to the Imperium itself, even in the absence of the Emperor's divine presence. But for the Blood Angels, the truth of the Emperor's death struck at the heart of their very identity. The Black Rage began to take hold once more, amplifying the chaos within their ranks. The Space Wolves, usually fierce and steadfast, withdrew into the cold isolation of Fenris, leaving the galaxy to burn while they mourned the loss of their spiritual father. The Ecclesiarchy, too, was thrown into disarray. Priests who had once rallied behind the emperor's divinity now faced a crisis of faith. The very foundation of their authority had crumbled. Cardinal Chireno, once a towering figure of religious power, was seen in secret meetings, whispering to the more radical elements within the ecclesiarchy. Many of them, too, turned to chaos, seeking solace in the embrace of the dark gods. Their faith was shaken beyond repair. Yet, it wasn't just the clergy and the tech priests that felt the rift. The ordinary soldiers of the Imperium, those who fought and died in the name of the Emperor, were beginning to question their place in this new world. In the shadow of the Emperor's death, what had they been fighting for all these years? Without the Emperor's divine will to guide them, were they still part of something greater than themselves? And then, there were the planetary governors. Worlds that had once been united under the Emperor's name now looked to their own interests. With the Emperor gone, the center could no longer hold. Governors declared their worlds independent. Military commanders seized control of their planets, and the once unified Imperium fractured into 1,000 pieces. There was no central authority to call them back into the fold. What remained was a galaxy that was slipping into anarchy. But amidst all this chaos, there was one truth that stood above all others. Humanity was still alive. They were broken, scattered, lost, but they were not dead. It was in this realization that the greatest question emerged. Could humanity survive the collapse of its faith? Odin felt the weight of this question every day. As the riots continued to rage on Terra and across the Imperium, he could hear the cries of humanity's despair. And yet, he could also feel the stirrings of something else, something dangerous. People were starting to look for new gods. Cults rose in the wake of the Emperor's death, promising salvation from the void left by the Emperor's passing. Some turned to chaos, others to the Xenos, but all of them sought something to hold on to in the wake of their shattered world. The final blow came when reports from the far-flung reaches of the galaxy confirmed what Odin had feared most. The Emperor's death had awakened something new. It wasn't just the loss of the Emperor's divinity that caused the galaxy to fracture. It was the vacuum that had been left behind. The warp, that chaotic and unpredictable realm, was changing. And with it, the forces of chaos began to stir. The question now was whether humanity could rebuild, or whether the collapse of the Emperor's faith would tear them apart once and for all. Could humanity survive this new age of darkness? Or would they fall under the sway of forces far more malevolent than the ones they had always feared? As Odin stood amidst the wreckage of the Imperium's faith, he realized that the galaxy had reached a crossroads. The Emperor was dead, the Imperium had shattered, and the future of humanity was uncertain. But one thing was clear: humanity's survival would depend not on the return of a god, but on their ability to adapt, to find strength in themselves rather than rely on the false hope of divine intervention. The galaxy was on the brink, but humanity's greatest strength had always been its resilience. Whether that resilience would be enough to carry them through the coming storm, only time would tell. What happens when an empire built on a lie faces its inevitable downfall? Can humanity survive when its foundation crumbles and there's no god to turn to? The Imperium was built on a lie. The Emperor, the god of mankind, the divine protector, was dead. His soul had long since faded, lost to the warp, leaving nothing behind but an empty shell on the golden throne. Odin's discovery, the truth of the Emperor's death, shattered everything. Once the galaxy's unquestioned faith, now the galaxy was fracturing. War, chaos, and rebellion spread like wildfire. In the heart of the Imperium Terra, the collapse was felt first. The streets, once full of devout worshippers, now ran with the blood of those caught in riots. Terra, the cradle of humanity, descended into anarchy as its citizens were thrust into the terrifying realization that the Emperor, who had stood as humanity's pillar for 10 millennia, was gone. The very foundation that had held the Imperium together for generations cracked. The mass hysteria was so intense, it was impossible to even tell where the riots began and where they ended. The air was thick with smoke, the ground soaked with the blood of the faithful. It was fear incarnate. In the midst of this chaos, Inquisitor Odin's mind struggled to keep up with the revelations that had torn his reality apart. His entire life had been dedicated to the Emperor's will, hunting down heretics, purging corruption, and serving the divine light of the God Emperor. But now, his faith was shattered, and the very duty he had held dear was laid bare as nothing more than a tool to maintain a colossal lie. What could Odin do when the truth was too terrible to ignore? Could humanity truly survive this collapse, or would it fall into the very darkness the Emperor had kept at bay for millennia? The fracturing didn't stop with the people. It spread through the factions that had once formed the backbone of the Imperium. The Adeptus Mechanicus, the tech priests who had revered the Emperor as the Omnissiah, quickly splintered. Some among them sought to preserve the physical form of the Emperor, turning the Golden Throne into a symbol of mechanical perfection. Others, more radical, declared that the time had come to create a new god. They believed that humanity had long outgrown the need for the Emperor's divine protection. The Mechanicus, once a unified force, now waged civil war, each faction fighting to claim dominion over the remnants of imperial knowledge and technology. Meanwhile, the Space Marines, those demigods of war, were not immune to the fracture. Some chapters, like the Imperial Fists and the Ultramarines, doubled down on their oaths of loyalty to the Imperium, but the emotional toll was undeniable. For chapters like the Blood Angels, the revelation of the Emperor's death sent them spiraling into despair. The Black Rage, a genetic curse tied to their Primarch's death, took hold in full force, and warriors who had once fought with unshakable resolve now found themselves driven by uncontrollable grief and anger. These were the soldiers who had once fought in the Emperor's name, but now they were shadows of themselves, lost and broken. But it wasn't just the military factions that were impacted. The ecclesiarchy, the heart of the Emperor's faith, found itself in turmoil. Cardinals and priests who had long used the Emperor's divinity to control the masses were now facing an existential crisis. With the truth now known, their foundation crumbled, and they too began to fracture. Cardinal Shiren, once a towering figure in the ecclesiarchy, now found herself secretly consorting with heretics, unable to reconcile the destruction of the Emperor's divinity with her place in the Imperium. Some turned to chaos, seeking new gods to fill the void. Others struggled to find a way to maintain their influence over the masses. Across the galaxy, planetary governors, once loyal servants of the Emperor, declared their worlds independent. The Imperium's fragile structure was now unraveling, world by world, as military commanders and political leaders seized control of their territories. The unity that had held humanity together for millennia was now a distant memory. No longer were they united by faith in the Emperor. They were divided by self-interest, fear, and the hunger for power. But amidst the chaos, a different kind of response began to emerge. Humanity, for all its flaws and weaknesses, had always been a resilient species. And though the collapse of the Emperor's faith had torn the Imperium asunder, it had not broken humanity's resolve. Some, like Inquisitor Cain, still held firm. Though his faith had been shattered, his sense of duty to humanity remained intact. There was still hope, however fragile, in humanity's ability to endure. Cain and others like him understood that, even without the Emperor's divine protection, they had something greater, something more important, at their disposal, the will to survive. The question now was whether that will would be enough. Could humanity rebuild? Or would they fall prey to the very forces they had fought to keep at bay for so long? The forces of chaos, ever hungry for souls, would not sit idly by as humanity's foundation crumbled. Already, cults whispered of new gods, chaotic forces who offered promises of power in exchange for devotion. Would humanity succumb to the dark whispers of the warp, or would they rise from the ashes of the Imperium and reclaim their place in the galaxy? For Odin, the answer was clear. Humanity's survival depended on the truth. The truth, he now realized, was their only weapon. It was the weapon that could free them from the Emperor's falsehood, from the chains of religious devotion that had bound them for millennia. The Emperor's death had shaken the Imperium to its core, but the truth of that death could still guide humanity through the chaos. The truth was not the end, but the beginning. If humanity could embrace it, if they could cast aside their old beliefs and adapt to a new reality, they might survive. But time was running out. The galaxy was burning, and humanity's greatest test was yet to come. Is it possible to rebuild from the ashes of a crumbling empire? Can humanity survive its greatest trial yet, or is the galaxy doomed to fall into the hands of chaos? The question that haunted Odin's every waking moment echoed louder than ever. Can humanity survive its own collapse? As the galaxy descended deeper into turmoil, the weight of that question grew heavier with each passing day. The Imperium, once a beacon of unity, was now a fractured, bleeding thing. Yet amid the wreckage, a glimmer of something new began to take root. But would it be enough to protect humanity from the abyss? The truth was humanity's last chance, Odin realized, and it would be up to those still loyal to the ideals of the Imperium to forge a new path. But the truth alone could not hold back the tide of chaos. The forces of the warp, once held at bay by the Emperor's divine will, were now creeping ever closer, hungry for the faith that had once been the foundation of human society. Without the Emperor's protection, humanity was vulnerable in ways it had never been before. But there were those who refused to let the Imperium fall into the grip of chaos. The Grey Knights, the Emperor's most elite and secretive warriors, stood ready to defend humanity from the forces that sought to destroy it. Their faith was not in the Emperor's divinity, but in humanity's potential to overcome the darkness. Grandmaster Orican, their leader, had long understood that the Emperor's vision for humanity was not one of blind worship, but of reason, unity, and progress. And now, with the Imperium in ruins, that vision was more important than ever. Orican's words rang in Odin's ears. The truth may burn down our civilization, but from its ashes a more honest one might rise. These were not just words of hope, they were a call to action. If humanity was to survive, it would not be by clinging to the past or trying to resurrect the Emperor's false divinity. It would be by embracing the truth, however painful, and forging a new future from the ruins of the old one. But could that truth truly unite the shattered remnants of the Imperium? Or would it lead them further into the embrace of chaos? The question loomed over Odin as he sat in the Grey Knight's fortress monastery on Titan, surrounded by the stoic faces of his allies. He had come to them for guidance, for clarity in a time of unprecedented crisis, and yet he found himself more uncertain than ever. The truth had set him on a path of discovery, but it had also led to the collapse of everything he had ever known. Now the truth was all that remained, and it was a truth that would change the galaxy forever. Cain, his most loyal acolyte, stood beside him, his expression unreadable. Cain had always been a man of faith, a soldier who believed in the Emperor's divinity with all his heart. But now, that faith had been shattered, just as Odin's had been. The question was no longer whether the Emperor had been a god, but whether humanity could survive in the absence of divine protection. Cain's unwavering duty to humanity had not faltered, even in the face of the truth. He understood the stakes. He understood that humanity's survival depended on them, on their ability to face the truth and rise above the lies that had bound them for millennia. "Is it possible?" Odin asked, his voice tinged with the weight of his own doubts. "Can humanity really rebuild from all this?" Cain's gaze met his, steadfast and unyielding. "We have no choice," he replied, his voice quiet but resolute. "We can either perish, consumed by chaos and the darkness, or we can find a way to survive together." The words struck Odin with the force of a revelation. Together. That was the key. Humanity had always been divided, united only by faith in a false god. Now, in the wake of that faith's destruction, they had an opportunity to build something new, something stronger, more resilient. They didn't need a god to save them. They needed each other. It wasn't just the Grey Knights who stood ready to defend humanity. There were others, factions, groups, and individuals who had long served the Imperium and who still believed in humanity's potential to overcome the forces of chaos. The question was whether they could set aside their differences and work together in the face of such overwhelming odds. But the forces of chaos were not idle. The dark gods of the warp had been watching, waiting for this moment of weakness. As faith in the Emperor crumbled, the warp itself had begun to stir, and new cults had risen, preaching that the time of human ascendancy was over, that the gods of the warp would be the new rulers of the galaxy. Demonic incursions increased. The veil between the real world and the immaterium weakened. Chaos had been waiting for this, waiting for humanity to tear itself apart, so that it could seize the remnants of the Imperium and usher in a new age of darkness. The battle for humanity's soul was just beginning. Odin knew this. He understood that the chaos, the violence, the destruction, these were just the beginning. The real battle was yet to come, and it would be fought not with swords and bolters, but with truth and unity. Would humanity rise to meet this challenge, or would they fall, consumed by their own despair and the corrupting influence of the warp? As Odin and Cain prepared to leave Titan and face the uncertainty of the galaxy beyond, the question of survival weighed heavily on them both. The truth had been revealed, but it was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The galaxy was on the verge of something new, something unknown. It could either rise from the ashes of the Imperium, or it could fall to the forces of chaos. The future of humanity was in their hands. The galaxy stood on the edge of an abyss. With the Emperor's death, humanity had lost its guiding light, its divine protector, and the foundation of its entire civilization. The truth, now revealed, had shattered the very core of the Imperium. And yet, amid the ruins, there was still hope, faint, fragile, but undeniable. It was the one thing the galaxy had left, the will to survive. As Odin and Cain stood together in the war-torn halls of the Grey Knights' fortress monastery, they knew that the fight for humanity's survival was far from over. The truth was no longer just a revelation, it was a weapon. But what would they do with it? Would they let it break them, as it had done to so many others, or would they use it to rebuild, to create something stronger, something more resilient? The galaxy had fallen into chaos, but it was not beyond redemption. Humanity had endured countless trials before, from the age of strife to the great heresy, and yet it had always managed to survive. The Emperor's original vision of a united humanity, one that would rise above superstition and religious dogma, had been lost in the centuries since his internment on the Golden Throne. But now, with the Emperor's death, that vision could be reclaimed, not as a false deity, but as a guiding principle for a new era. The question, however, was whether humanity was ready to accept it. Could they set aside their beliefs, their loyalties to a dead god, and embrace the truth that had always been buried beneath the weight of their faith? Could they rise above the chaos, above the manipulation of the warp, and build a new future based on reason, unity, and self-determination? Cain, ever the loyal soldier, was ready to face whatever came next. "We don't have the luxury of despair," he said, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of their collective burden. "The Imperium is gone, but humanity is still here. We will fight for its future." But Odin knew it wouldn't be that simple. The chaos that had consumed the Imperium had already begun to spread throughout the galaxy, and it wasn't just the forces of chaos that threatened humanity's future. The collapse of faith had left a vacuum, and in that vacuum, new powers were rising. Chaos, of course, sought to seize the opportunity, but there were other forces at work: alien races, rogue factions, and even old enemies within the Imperium who saw the Emperor's death as their chance to claim power for themselves. The question of survival had become a battle not just against the warp, but against those who would seek to exploit the chaos for their own ends. And in this new reality, there was no longer a single unifying force to keep humanity in check. The once great military of the Imperium, its fleets and legions, was now fragmented, with some chapters of space marines turning against each other, and planetary governors declaring their independence. Yet amidst this fracturing, there were still those who believed in humanity's potential. The Grey Knights, though small in number, were unwavering in their commitment to protecting mankind from the forces that sought to destroy it. Their leader, Grandmaster Orican, had always believed that humanity could transcend its reliance on divine protection, and in this dark hour, he was proven right. The Grey Knight's faith was not in a god, but in humanity's ability to survive and thrive, no matter the odds. "We are not alone in this," Orican had told Odin. "The galaxy is vast, and there are forces who still believe in humanity's future. We must find them, unite them, and show them that there is still hope." Hope. It was a word that had lost its meaning for so many, but it was still there, burning quietly in the hearts of those who refused to give up. In the wake of the Imperium's collapse, new alliances could be formed, new foundations laid. The galaxy was a shattered place, but from the ashes of the old order, a new one could rise, one based on truth, on unity, on the strength of the human spirit. As Odin prepared to leave Titan and embark on his journey to spread the truth, he couldn't help but wonder if humanity was truly ready for what was to come. The truth had already shaken the galaxy to its core. Now, it was time to see if humanity could face it with the courage it would take to rebuild. The warp was a dangerous place, and chaos was never far behind. But Odin knew that the greatest danger was not the enemy outside, it was the enemy within. Humanity's fear, its uncertainty, its addiction to faith and superstition. These were the things that had brought it to the brink of destruction. Now they had to learn to embrace something new, their own strength. Cain stood beside him, his expression hardening with resolve. "We may not have the Emperor anymore," he said, "but we have each other, and we will fight for humanity's survival." The journey ahead would be long, fraught with danger, and the odds would be against them. But for the first time in a long while, Odin felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The Imperium may have fallen, but humanity was not done yet. It was time for a new beginning. With the fall of the Emperor's divine light, who will lead humanity now? Can they stand against the rising forces of chaos, or will the galaxy descend into eternal darkness? As the war-torn galaxy reeled from the shock of the Emperor's death, the question on everyone's mind was, who will guide us now? The Emperor's absence had left a vacuum so vast, so profound, that its consequences were still unfolding across the galaxy. Without a divine protector, humanity was faced with the terrifying prospect of navigating the stars alone. But there were those who refused to accept this fate. The battle for the future of humanity was far from over. It was only just beginning. The collapse of the Emperor's divine myth had sent shockwaves through every corner of the Imperium. Once, his very name had been enough to unite billions under a banner of unquestioning loyalty. Now, his death had shattered that unity. Entire worlds, once steadfast in their devotion to the Emperor, were now questioning everything they had ever believed. The ecclesiarchy, once the heart of the Imperium's faith, was crumbling under the weight of its own lies. Priests who had spent their lives preaching the Emperor's divinity were now faced with a staggering truth. Their god had been a man who had fought for humanity, but who had never claimed to be divine. Some within the Imperium refused to accept this truth. They clung to the past, to the comforting illusion of the Emperor's eternal presence. The remnants of the imperial cult attempted to salvage whatever faith they could, twisting the facts and preaching that the Emperor's death was simply a trial, a test of humanity's devotion. But their words rang hollow. The galaxy no longer believed in their promises. And in the darkness of their despair, new cults arose, some seeking to take the place of the Emperor, others embracing the dark forces of the warp in the hope of gaining power where faith had failed them. But amidst the chaos, the Grey Knights remained unshaken. They were the Emperor's last defenders, a brotherhood forged in secrecy and honor, bound not by faith but by duty. Grandmaster Orican, their leader, had never placed his faith in the Emperor's divinity. Instead, he believed in humanity's potential, its ability to overcome its darkest moments and rise above the chaos. For him, the Emperor was not a god, but a symbol of humanity's strength. It was that symbol that the Grey Knights now defended. Orican had long known that the Imperium's reliance on the Emperor's divinity was its greatest weakness, but even he had never anticipated the devastation that would follow the Emperor's death. It was a loss unlike any other, one that threatened to unravel the very fabric of human civilization. The Imperium was not just facing external threats, it was facing an existential crisis. And within that crisis, there were those who sought to exploit humanity's fear, to bring it to its knees. But the Grey Knights were not without hope. They had seen humanity at its worst, but they had also seen its greatest potential. In the wake of the Emperor's death, they were determined to preserve that potential. Grandmaster Orican called for unity among those who still believed in humanity's future, and unity against the growing threat of chaos. The forces of chaos had not been idle. As the galaxy spiraled into turmoil, the warp itself began to stir. The collapse of faith had opened the door to the dark gods, and they were eager to seize the opportunity. Cults of chaos sprang up across the galaxy, preaching that the time had come for humanity to embrace the true gods of the warp. They promised power, immortality, and freedom from the Emperor's oppressive rule. But their promises came at a cost, one that would lead humanity into the jaws of corruption and madness. The Grey Knights were humanity's first line of defense against these dark forces, but their numbers were few, and the galaxy was vast. Grandmaster Orican knew that they could not fight this battle alone. The truth they carried, humanity's potential to rise above the chaos, was a weapon more powerful than any sword or bolter. But would humanity be willing to wield it? Odin, now a broken man after uncovering the truth of the Emperor's death, had found his answer. It was not a question of faith, it was a question of survival. Humanity had lost its god, but it had not lost its will to live. There was strength in that will. There was power in their collective determination to endure, to rebuild, to fight back against the darkness that threatened to consume them. But even Odin, a man who had dedicated his life to the service of the Emperor, could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a strange energy in the warp, something new, something different. As the chaos of the galaxy unfolded, it was as if the Emperor's very absence had given birth to something else, a new presence in the Immaterium, something that had never existed before. Could it be that the Emperor's consciousness, his psychic power, had not truly vanished into the warp? Could it be that humanity's collective belief had shaped him into something else entirely? A new god born from the will of the people, rather than from the divine? The very thought sent a chill through Odin's spine. As he and Cain prepared for the next step in their journey, they knew the stakes had never been higher. The forces of chaos were gathering. The Imperium was in ruins. And yet, humanity still had one last weapon: the truth. It was not the Emperor's divine light that would save them, but the strength of their own will. Together, they would stand against the darkness. But the question remained, would it be enough? What happens when the very foundation of a civilization is shattered? Can the truth of humanity's origins save them from the chaos that looms? Or will they fall prey to the powers of the warp? The collapse of the Emperor's divine myth had sent ripples throughout the galaxy. But the truth that had been buried beneath centuries of faith, was still there, burning with an undeniable clarity. As the Imperium fractured and chaos tore through once stable systems, there was one question that continued to haunt every faction, every individual across the galaxy. What happens next? For Odin and Cain, the discovery had been a bitter revelation. The Emperor, the figurehead of humanity's existence, the symbol of their divine protector, was gone. But the truth of his death wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that was as uncertain as it was terrifying. The realization that humanity had been built on a lie sent shockwaves, not just through the highest ranks of the Imperium, but to the very core of human belief. And with that, new possibilities emerged. Could humanity, now bereft of divine protection, rise on its own? Or would it crumble in the face of chaos and destruction? As Odin's ship drifted through the warp, his thoughts were a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. The revelation he had uncovered was not just a threat to the Imperium. It was a challenge to humanity itself. The Emperor, as it turned out, had never been the divine god they believed him to be. But what then? Did that mean for the billions of souls who had dedicated their lives to his worship? What did it mean for the countless worlds that relied on the Emperor's myth to keep the peace, to maintain order in a galaxy teeming with enemies? The question gnawed at Odin, even as the first stirrings of hope began to blossom. If the Emperor was not a god, if his divinity was nothing but a constructed lie, then perhaps humanity had been freed from the shackles of a false faith, freed from the chains of superstition that had kept them in servitude for millennia. But this freedom came with a price. It was a freedom that was terrifying in its vastness, a freedom that threatened to unravel the very fabric of existence itself. The galaxy was now a place without direction, without a guiding force to keep it together. And in that vacuum, chaos stirred. Chaos, both within the Imperium and beyond, was no longer just an external enemy. It was a force that had long been insidious, creeping beneath the surface of humanity's collective consciousness. The warp, that vast and malevolent dimension, was now free to claim what was rightfully its own. The forces of chaos had already begun to seize the opportunity. Cults sprang up like weeds, their influence spreading through the once loyal ranks of the Imperium, their promises of power, immortality, and a new order appealing to the lost and disillusioned. The Emperor's death had opened a door to the ruinous gods, and they were more than eager to walk through it. But even as chaos threatened to consume the galaxy, there were those who refused to surrender. The Grey Knights, ever steadfast in their duty, understood the enormity of the situation. Grandmaster Orican, who had long recognized the fallibility of the Emperor, saw a glimmer of hope in humanity's collective will. It was not faith in a divine figure that would save them. It was the unity, the strength of purpose that would define their future. "We are not gods," Orican had said to Odin, his voice unwavering. "We are men and women born of flesh and blood, forged in the fires of war. But we are human, and it is humanity that will determine the fate of the galaxy." But could humanity truly withstand the pressure? Could they stand up to the forces of chaos that now threaten to tear the galaxy apart? In the absence of the Emperor, who would lead them? Who could unite the scattered remnants of the Imperium and forge a new future from the ashes of the old? The truth was more complex than Odin had anticipated. The Emperor, for all his flaws and sacrifices, had still been the one thing that had kept humanity united. His death was not just a physical loss. It was the loss of the ideal that had shaped everything humanity had built. And yet, as the days passed and the truth spread, it became clear that this was not the end. It was the beginning of something else. In the darkness of the warp, the forces of chaos could feel the shifting tides. They could sense the unraveling of the Emperor's power and the weakening of the Imperium. But in the same breath, they could also feel something new, something powerful stirring in the hearts of humanity. The truth was a force unto itself, a force that, while devastating, had the potential to break the chains that had bound humanity for so long. The question now was how to harness that truth. Would humanity be able to rise above the chaos and rebuild? Or would they fall to the whims of the dark gods that had waited so long for this moment? The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The Emperor's death had irrevocably changed the course of history. The old order was gone, and something new was taking shape, a new vision for humanity's future. As Odin gazed into the swirling madness of the warp, he felt a profound sense of unease. The truth had set humanity free, but freedom came with a price. And as the galaxy stood on the precipice of its darkest hour, the only question that remained was whether humanity would survive the storm. Could they find their way in the dark without the Emperor's guiding light? Or would the forces of chaos claim them as their own? When everything that humanity built its future on crumbles, what will rise from the ashes? Can they survive the collapse, or will they be consumed by the chaos they've unleashed? In the aftermath of the Emperor's death, the Imperium had descended into a state of profound disarray. The central pillar that had held the galaxy's civilizations together was gone, and with it, the certainty of humanity's destiny. The world was no longer united under a single vision. Instead, countless factions now scrambled to fill the vacuum, each one grappling with the same question: what happens now? The question was not just philosophical, it was practical. There were no longer any unquestionable directives. Without a central guiding authority, every planet, every system, every faction was left to fend for itself. And in that absence, the forces of chaos began to make their presence felt, spreading like an infection through the cracks in humanity's once pristine armor. But amid the rising chaos, a quiet rebellion took place. It wasn't one fought with weapons, but with a conviction far deeper than any sword or gun. The truth that had been revealed, the brutal, undeniable truth, had shattered the illusion that humanity had lived under for millennia. Yet in that very collapse, something unexpected emerged: resilience. For all the destruction, for all the confusion, there were those who still believed in humanity's strength. They believed that the future of humanity was not defined by some distant figure or deity, but by the very will of the people themselves. This was not a future of passive devotion or submission, but a future of active determination. Odin, despite the weight of his discovery, could not escape this truth. He had uncovered the reality that had torn down the foundation of the Imperium, but that revelation did not mean the end. Far from it. What it had done was open up new possibilities for humanity's future, possibilities that transcended the failed doctrine that had once held them captive. His personal journey mirrored that of countless others. They had all been lied to, all been manipulated into believing that their fate was controlled by something outside of themselves. But now, with that illusion gone, a new path lay open before them. The path was uncertain, fraught with danger and filled with the unknown. But it was theirs to walk, and that made all the difference. It wasn't just Odin who felt this change. Cain, his most trusted ally, had always held onto the rigidity of duty, following orders without question. Now, he too was confronted by a new reality. The universe was no longer as simple as black and white. No longer could duty be defined by a single source of authority. Cain's internal battle had been ignited by the revelation, and he stood at the crossroads of doubt and faith. His resolve had always been unshaken, but now it was being tested in ways he could never have anticipated. "Perhaps it is time," Cain had said quietly, staring out into the void of the warp, "that we stop following what we were told and start deciding for ourselves what is right." It was a chilling thought, but it was one that rang true. Humanity's survival, its ability to endure in the face of overwhelming odds, rested not on the strength of an emperor or the legitimacy of any single entity. It rested in their will to stand firm, to rise above the chaos and forge a future based on their collective strength. The very chaos that threatened to destroy them could, paradoxically, become the catalyst for their rebirth. Across the Imperium, whispers of this new ideology began to spread. While some still clung to the old ways, refusing to let go of the myth that had sustained them for so long, others began to see the truth. Humanity had the power to shape its own future. They did not need the guidance of any central figure. What they needed was unity, purpose, and the strength to overcome the challenges that lay ahead. The forces of chaos were not idle, however. They were ever present, lurking in the darkness, waiting to take advantage of humanity's disarray. The very thing that had protected humanity, its unity and belief in a common cause, was now fractured, leaving them vulnerable to the dark forces that thrived on fear and despair. But the war was not yet lost. While humanity's institutions may have been fractured, the spirit of resistance was not. The Imperium, though broken, still had its defenders. The Grey Knights, the Space Marines, and the few loyal elements within the Adeptus Mechanicus all stood as bulwarks against the tide of chaos. But they were not invincible. The battle to come would be one not of strength alone, but of heart, will, and a shared purpose. Even as Odin and Cain prepared to face what lay ahead, they knew that the fight for humanity's future would not be easy. The galaxy was vast, and the forces arrayed against them were numerous and powerful. But in the deepest heart of humanity, something stirred, a flicker of hope, a renewed sense of self-determination. They had been shown the truth, and in that truth, they had discovered a new purpose. Humanity could stand on its own 2 feet. But the question remained, would they? Could they rise from the ashes of the Imperium's collapse, or would they fall prey to the darkness? When everything you've believed in crumbles before your eyes, can you rebuild from the ruins? Or will you be swallowed whole by the chaos you helped unleash? The galaxy was burning, not from the fire of a single enemy, but from the unraveling of an entire civilization. The fabric of the Imperium, once held together by the shared belief in the Emperor's divine protection, was now fraying at the edges. And in that chaotic, uncertain moment, humanity stood at a precipice. What would become of them? Could they rise from the ashes of the empire they had built, or would they fall into the abyss, lost to the dark forces that had waited so long for this moment? Odin, now fully aware of the weight of his discovery, found himself standing in the midst of this chaos. The truth had shattered the foundation of everything they had known, and the first ripple of that truth had been a wave of disbelief, anger, and fear. But what came next? What did humanity do when the very thing that had defined their existence, what they had based their hope and purpose on for 10 millennia, was proven to be false? How did they rebuild from the destruction of their faith? This was the question that plagued Odin as he watched the galaxy tear itself apart. His mind, once focused solely on the duty to the Emperor and the Imperium, now turned inward. Could humanity survive without the Emperor's guidance? Was the future of mankind tied to a single being, or did their survival depend on something more, something within themselves? The answer wasn't simple. Across the galaxy, the reactions were as varied as the stars themselves. Some, like the Adeptus Mechanicus, still clung to the remnants of the Emperor's myth, twisting it into a new religion of machines and knowledge. Others, like the Space Marines, found themselves torn. Could they continue to serve a fallen emperor? Or were they now free to define their own purpose, to live without the divine burden they had carried for so long? And then there were those who had already begun to embrace the truth. The human factions that had once whispered of rebellion, who had questioned the emperor's power, now found themselves in the light of this revelation. For them, the truth was not a burden but a catalyst for change. They no longer feared the unknown because the greatest fear had already been faced. The emperor was dead, but humanity was still alive, still capable of greatness. But the darkness that had always loomed on the horizon was not gone. As the truth spread, the forces of chaos, ever hungry for the souls of the lost and disillusioned, began to seize their opportunity. The power that had once held them at bay, the belief in the emperor, was now crumbling. And as it did, the dark gods of the warp began to stir once more. Their influence spread like a poison, tainting everything it touched. It was not just the external forces of chaos that humanity had to contend with, but the internal turmoil. The truth, while freeing in some respects, had also opened the door to a much darker future. There were factions within the Imperium that, even in the face of the truth, still clung to the idea of the Emperor as the pinnacle of human achievement. They refused to accept the reality of his death, clinging to the belief that the Emperor's light could somehow return. But this was a lie, one that would only hasten their fall. And yet, even within the darkest corners of the Imperium, there were those who still believed. They believed in humanity's potential, in their ability to adapt, to change, and to survive. But belief was no longer enough. Action was required. The galaxy, now thrown into chaos, needed new leaders, new visions, and new ways of thinking. Odin, torn between the guilt of his revelation and the determination to ensure humanity's survival, knew what had to be done. There was no going back. The Emperor was gone, but the future of humanity still rested in their hands. It was up to those who understood the truth, not just Odin, but the others who had seen the galaxy's potential beyond the confines of old myths, to lead the charge into an uncertain future. As Odin stood in the midst of the broken Imperium, his thoughts were interrupted by the reality of what lay ahead. Chaos was not just a force outside their walls, it was within them. It was in their fractured beliefs, their divided allegiances, and their desperate attempts to hold onto the past. But even within that chaos, there was hope. Hope that humanity, if it could see past the lie that had defined it for so long, could rebuild something new, something stronger, something that didn't rely on false gods or ancient doctrines. The collapse of the Emperor's myth had left a gaping hole in the galaxy. But that hole was also an opportunity. It was the chance for humanity to define its own future, free from the shackles of its past. But that future was not guaranteed. It would require sacrifice, unity, and strength in the face of an overwhelming darkness. The question was no longer whether humanity could survive. The question was, what kind of humanity would emerge from the ashes?